Hello and welcome back to the Classics podcast, Does Virgil's Aeneid, with myself, Katrina Kelly.
And me, Caroline Lawrence.
This is the podcast where we take a deep dive into Virgil's epic poem, exploring imagery, themes, characters, and much more. And last week we found out just how sad and melancholy the poem can be. And we spoke about lacrimae, the tears that befall lots of the characters. But there was a more positive side to it too. And today we're going to be jumping into a really fun topic. So, Caroline, what is our word for today?
Our word for today is Purpureus.
And I think people can guess what the word means from the word. But we're going to give a couple of dictionary definitions of the word purple.
Yeah, so the literal definition is purple colored, but purple, including very different shades of color like red, reddish, violet, brownish, blackish. We'll be talking more about this, and it's mostly poetic according to the dictionary. And then the second big definition, it says does that mean transferred when you transfer the color to an object, and it stands for an object, I guess. So
I think so.
It can also mean clothed in purple, which is the poetic for purpuratus. And a very strange one, it can mean brilliant, shining, bright, or beautiful, and we'll get to why a little bit later. In my recent book, Pantheon, an illustrated guide to the Greek gods and goddesses, and Roman gods and goddesses, I slipped in a little info box about one of my obsessions, how the Greeks used color. And I now realize I forgot to include the Greek version of Purpureus, which is Porphyreos, which is kind of okay because Homer only uses it a few times. And the purple is made from murex, a sea snail that must die to give its dye. Now, a scholar I really rate and admire is Mark Bradley. He's an expert on color in the Greco-Roman world. He talks about the synesthetic aspects of colors. To paraphrase him, he points out, for example, that Homer's sea is obviously not wine. His wine-dark sea, oinops, is not wine-colored like red wine or even fresh almost black wine, but it's more of a sense that wine can make you unsteady, queasy, slightly wobbly with an element of danger, like being at sea.
Yeah, so in the synesthetic aspect then of these Greco-Roman words, purple conveys a taint of death and blood, doesn't it? Because a living creature would normally have to die in order to give forth that colour.
Yes, and one of my favourite Roman poets is the cynical poet Martial, who was a century after Virgil, but he's so useful. In book 13 of his epigrams, those are a collection of little short poems, especially written for the Saturnalia, called the Xenia, after the Greek word for gifts given to visitors. He writes a kind of a sardonic couplet from the point of view of the murex, of this little tiny crustacean, the murices, the sea snails that give purple.
Exactly. I mean, we should say at this point, shouldn't we, that although purpurea is our word for the day and it means purple, that there were other words as well, because purpurea could be linked to the word Punic or Phoenician. And then we've also got the word ostrum and murex, which could also be interchange used for purple, because those are the two that reference these crustacea from which the dye comes, especially murex.
Yeah, and in case we don't say it later, we will say it later, but just two things about the production of purple dye. One, it was a Phoenician thing. They loved doing it. And also, it was fabulously expensive. So I'm sure we'll say that later, but wanted to get it out of the way in case we forget.
Definitely to keep it in mind as we go through. So,
you want to read Martial's little epic?
Let's have a bit of Martial before we actually even get any Virgil today. So this is Martial's 13 Mureces. Sanguine bis nostro tinctas ingrate lacernas induis, et non est hoc satis, esque sumus. Ungrateful man, you put on cloaks dyed twice in our blood, but this isn't enough. We're your main course.
So I love that. Martial's so clever. In fact, it wasn't the blood of the sea snail, the murex, it was its mucus.
Lovely.
But they did die, and the Roman understanding of how the dye came was that they vomited up their blood, and that you had to get them really fast before they vomited up their blood. And that's really interesting, that whole concept of how these little tiny shells vomited up their blood is going to link later with young men vomiting up their purple blood or lives. So yeah, and again, as we said before, they needed thousands of these little shells, so it was a fabulously expensive process. The first time we meet purple in the Aeneid is a very interesting time. It's when Venus in disguise has appeared to Aeneas. He's been shipwrecked on the shores of Carthage, doesn't know where he is, but this kind of sexy hunter girl appears in a mini tunic and purple hunting boots. It's his mum in disguise, but he doesn't know that yet. And she's explaining her fashion choice to him. Do you want to read it?
Sure. And we've come back to this passage so many times, haven't we, in completely different contexts. It's such an important scene, even if on the face of it, it's not doesn't seem the most important on a plot sense. But we talked about it in relation to mothers and fathers, and again to ambiguity, that sense of the erotic, and now with purple. Aeneid 1:336, following on. Tum Venus, haud equidam talle mei dignor honore, virginibus tiris mus esgestare feretram, Purpureus quae alte suras vincere cothurno. Then Venus said, I am hardly worthy of the honour of being called a goddess or sister of Apollo or nymph. It's the custom for Tyrian girls to carry a quiver and wear purple hunting boots laced high up. So, straight away, as we said, purple is linked to Tyrians, i.e. Phoenicians, and that gives a strong association to Carthage, Rome's recent enemy, if we think back to the Augustan time, and the antithesis of everything Rome stands for. This is linked with thoughts of decadence and danger, luxury, royalty, and not only is Venus here appearing in that way, but we do have that sense of latent danger because she's in disguise. She isn't all that she says she is. And we should remember that the Phoenicians were a Semitic race of seafaring traders who lived mainly on the coasts in cities such as Tyre, which is where we think of to do with Dido, Sidon and Carthage. So any words like Tyrian, Punic would all be hyperlinked in the Roman reader's mind to Carthage, their recent enemy. And if we think back as well, we can think of another example that we've already discussed lots of times because it has multiple meanings and links, is in our Curva episode on Dido as the doe. We mentioned the part where Dido lingers, she's cunctantem, lingers and hesitating in her bedroom, apparently along with this strange stallion, which might represent her desire, as we said, and either Dido or the horse, or perhaps both of them, because we don't quite know which adjectives we're referring to whom, are ostroque insignis et auro, that is, outstanding in purple and gold. And then when Aeneas arrives at the palace, she decks out everywhere with purple and gold. So these are very much two symbols of wealth, aren't they, Carol?
Yeah, they often go together as symbols of opulence, royalty, wealth, decadence. And here's a fun fact. There were 4 racing factions in Rome, each one named after a color. Can you name them?
I think so. I'm going to have to unlock my Roman mysteries brain to remember. And I think there were the greens, definitely. The blues, the reds, and whites.
Absolutely. And here's a fascinating thing. Each one represents one of the 4 seasons and its associated element or humors, the humors.
Mm-hmm.
Theory. In the late 1st century, the evil Emperor Domitian, he tried to add 2 new factions. Guess which colors? And here's a hint, we've just been talking about them.
I never. Would that be purple and gold?
Would, but they never caught on.
Yeah, I mean, there's an element of having too much of a good thing, isn't there? There's too much extravagance and even hubris, maybe, with purple and gold. It's almost overdoing it with the expense, the links to divinity. And we get it again when Aeneas is happily helping to build Carthage, right? This is one of the visual signs by which everything appears to be going really well, but actually maybe he's being too distracted from his mission because he's described as being in a purple cloak made by Dido herself and with a golden sword given to him by her as a gift. And then suddenly Mercury appears and says, what on earth do you think you're doing, Aeneas? And we can compare that to the bit I just mentioned in book 1 when he arrives at the palace. And it's so then Father Aeneas and then also the men of Troy, they arrived and then they reclined, they relaxed on purple coverlets.
Ooh, that's decadent.
Yeah, straight away into this decadent scene. And I think the Roman reader would be a bit... This is a little bit sketchy.
But going back to that passage, it's poor Aeneas. It's one of the few times he's happy when he's set off to build a new Troy and he's landed with this beautiful woman who who has so much in common with him, and she's building a new city. So here he is, happily building some walls and some roofs, and he's getting on with it. He's very happy. And then suddenly Mercury arrives to tell him to get on with his mission. And I'll just read a bit. Ut primum alatis tetigit magalia plantis, Aenean fundantum misactecta novan conspicitat quilis stellatus jaspide fulva, ensiserat tirioquar debat murice laina, de missa exumeris dives quae munera dido fecerat et tenui telas discreveret auro. Lots of yellow in that passage as well. As Mercury first lands on the huts with winged feet, he sees Aeneas building defensive walls and new roofs. He, Aeneas, had a sword studded with yellow jasper, and a woolen cloak blazing with Tyrian purple hung from his shoulders, a gift which wealthy Dido had made for him, weaving the cloth with threads of gold. And notice in this passage we have one of the other words for purple, murex, but linked with Tyrian, i.e. Phoenician. So we strongly associate purple with Carthage, Dido, decadence. That's the hyperlink that would immediately have set off all these images and sparks in a Roman brain. If I were to say to you, without knowing that we're talking about this, tell me about purple in ancient times, your first association would probably be Rome, wouldn't it? And especially imperial Rome.
Exactly. I'd be thinking as well of the films we've seen, Gladiator and the rest, where we've got an emperor who in some ways is showing off their purple.
That's right. And Pliny the Elder has several chapters about purple, how it in the Fishy book, and he writes that I find that from the very first, purple had been in use in Rome, even before, like during the original kings and then the Republic and then the new empire. We can put up the parallel passage there for people to see possibly, but it's Pliny the Elder, Natural History 9 and passage 63. 63.
Yeah, and so we know that going to a pre-imperial time, that Roman magistrates wore a toga praetexta, so that's the white toga edged in this purple, and that generals, when they were celebrating a triumph, wore the toga picta, so that was solid purple with gold edging. I mean, that was it's kind of as close, isn't it, as to they got in the Roman Republic to being like a monarch and everything that they were trying ostensibly to say that they weren't doing, that they were a republic and not a monarchy, but that would still give everyone that real impression of such splendour, such success. And Augustus himself would have certainly worn purple. In fact, during the Empire, so it was then illegal to wear solid purple unless you were the emperor, and that really shows that shift in the political context. Later, purple stood for emperor in the phrase to don the purple, which meant to become emperor, literally.
I love metonymy. That's one of my favorite little rhetorical devices. So yes, an ancient Roman would have also associated purple with Rome, which means we have again this, even without Virgil being present, purple was a very ambiguous, it was a word, it was very conflicting because it makes us think of Rome and of Carthage, the kind of polar opposites. And an interesting thing about colors, another interesting thing about colors in the ancient world, and I think this is one of the clearest ways where we know their mindset's different from ours. They often, almost always associate a color with an object, a concrete thing. So flawless, tawny, would primarily be associated with hair, like you have flawless hair, you have tawny hair. That's exactly the color, kind of the skin of a lion, beautiful color. And the primary association of purple would be with cloth, dyed with this purple dye, with the blood of this tiny sea creature. And so just as there are shades of meaning in the color purple, in the meaning of the word purple, there would also have been shades of color in the dyeing. I've tried doing some natural dyeing in researching my books, and you have to use something called a mordant, which sometimes will change the color. It's like, I think, some kind of a chemical, or you can use something like a plant called alkanet. Anyway, and just adding that mordant, it means bites, will change the color of something. So you can dye something with onion skin and it comes out one color, and add a little mordant, it suddenly subtly changes the color. And in book 9 of his Natural History, and then of course if you double dye it or you add other things, or you get the cheap dye, there are cheap variants. Pliny talks about the shades can range from a delicate amethyst to purple so dark it's almost black.
And it is a really attractive colour. I mean, I say this also because I'm a Pisces, so amethyst is my birthstone, so gotta love purple, always have done. But you can understand why people throughout the ages have really valued it, not just for the cost, but for the depth and the beauty of that colour itself. And purple can be associated with such good, beautiful things. I mean, in the natural world, so many beautiful purple flowers, for example.
And Virgil uses purple flowers, but usually associated with death. By the way, I have to just mention Alice Walker's famous book, The Color Purple, about an enslaved woman in the American South. There's a great quote. The title comes from a quote by a character in the book, not the main character, called Shug Avery, and she says, "It pisses God off if you walk by the color purple in a field somewhere and don't notice it." So that line, I think, is us to celebrate beauty in the world, even during very hard times. And it kind of embodies that novel's themes of finding a new spirituality and a new joy. But purple has darker connotations, doesn't it?
It does indeed. So we're going to go to the gory side of purple now because, as you say, it could be reddish brown to really dark purple, almost black, almost like that crusty blood, which is often called black in Virgil. And as you mentioned Pliny, he's got several long passages on purple in the fishy section of his natural history. And so this is what he writes in one of them. Purple is considered of the best quality when it has exactly the colour of clotted blood, and is of a blackish hue to the sight, but of a shining appearance when held up to the light. Hence it is that we find Homer speaking of purple blood.
Yeah, and speaking of blood, there's one episode in the Aeneid where we find lots of purple prose, which is the night raid, the so-called night raid of Nisus and Euryalus, or Nisus and Euryalus, but I say Nisus and Euryalus, in Book 9, where two young warriors go on a daring night raid mission to sneak through sleeping enemy soldiers and recruit help from Aeneas, who's gone off to get some other armies. But as they sneak through the enemy on tippy toes, they realize they're sleeping so deeply, they decide to start killing them and start chopping off heads. And here's a lovely line from the Aeneid, and then I'm going to read my Dryden. I love this translation. Purpureum vomit illanimam met cum sanguine mixta, vina refert moriens, hic furto fervidus instat. The Latins are sleeping deeply because they've been drinking wine, which will explain the translation by Dryden. The wound pours out a stream of wine and blood. The purple soul comes floating in the flood.
So good.
I love that. And in my retelling of the night raid for teen readers, I kind of give a nod to Dryden's translation. The neck pours out a stream of wine and blood. I think I see his soul come floating in the flood. So that's almost plagiarism. Dryden was writing in the 1600s, so I think I'm safe. And I think I've done a little capture. If you're watching YouTube, you might be able to see that.
Yeah, and Homer doesn't really use the word purple, we said Purpureus, very often, but it does occur in a similar battle scene to describe death in Iliad 5. So, in matosaya decer pedio pesse, ton de kata hosse elabe porphoreos thanatos kain moira kratia. The bloody hand fell to the ground, and down over his eyes came purple death and powerful fate. So there, it's not just the blood that's described or something pouring out, it is death itself, porphoreos thanatos.
Yeah, and just, I'm going to correct your one pronunciation, the first word, haimatoessa, because there's a little tiny rough breathing, and haima is bloody. That's quite gory. I mean, Homer could be, so can Virgil. Virgil, I called him gentle last episode, but he gets very gory. I love that. And actually Pliny talks about how Virgil talks about purple death. And I said, does he? But he does. There's a part where he says purple death. One of the most fascinating aspects to me, because I'm about the sensory, the ancient world and all its sensory aspects, because I'm very in my right brain, is that it smelled really foul. It smelled really fishy. And I learned that again from my friend Marshall.
Yeah, I guess it would. We have to think, don't we, of the clothes being washed in urine, and maybe if they were dyed purple, smelling of fish.
I know. Well, yeah, but this is a thing we don't realize. And this one kind of a few Marshall's one of the few people I know who mentions this, and he is about the sensory world, which is why I like him so much, though he was probably a horrible person. He was a misogynist and anti-Semite and all sorts of other things. But anyway, this is his poem, which he writes to a friend to say that he lists all the horrible things he could, the most horrible smells in ancient Rome, and then says, but none of them smell as bad as you do. Quod sicae redolent palis lacunae, crudarum nebulae quod albularum, piscinae vetus aura quod marinae, quod presa piger hircus in capella lassi vardaicus, quod evocati, quod bismurice velis inquinatum, quod iunia sabbatiarum, maestrorum quod angelitus reorum, quod spurcae moriens lucerna ledae, quod ceromata facie de Sabina, quod volpis fuga, vipera cubile, malum quam quod oles olere, bassa. Take a swamp stinking of dried up lake, the sulphurous clouds rising up Albula's spring, the stale stench of a saltwater fish pond. Take a lazy he-goat in the middle of rutting, the tired boots of a veteran from Illyria, or a sheep's pelt twice dipped in murex dye, the breath of women who fast on the Sabbath, the panting of panicking defendants in court. Take the smoking night lamp of dirty Leda. Take the impure wrestler's mud from the Sabine hills. Take a frightened fox or a viper's nest. I'd rather smell any of these, Bassa, than you.
What an incredible list. I mean, there's some wonderful vocabulary in there, isn't it? It's so rich.
And again, it's a smellscape. It's olfactory, isn't it? And I'm afraid I was a bit catty to Dido in my book, Achates, Soul of a Hero. That's my retelling of the Aeneid from a dog's point of view, because, of course, if Aeneas's faithful friend Achates was a dog and not a person. And so dogs are always referencing things by smell. Then did you know this? Did you know that purple smelled foul?
Well, again, I only know it from the Roman mysteries. That's how I found out. You also really brought to life that smellscape.
Oh, I'm so glad. Although it has the foul smell and can signify snooty opulence, it also does have positive connotations. And here's one of the weirdest aspects of purple. It can be used to describe youthful, vigorous beauty, as when Aeneas glows with purple youth when he's first revealed to Dido after the Venus makeover. Remember, he's in a cloud of invisibility, and he's like watching Dido. He and Achates are in this cloud of watching Dido interact with the Trojans from one of the other ships. And suddenly Venus whips away the cloud, and there he is. Restitit Aeneas claraquin lucere fulsit, os humerosque deos similis nam quipsa decorum, Caesarium nato genetrix luminque juventae, purpureum et laetos oculosad flaret honores, quale manus adunte bori decus autubi flavo, argentum pariusve lapis circumdatur auro. Aeneas stood shining in the brilliant light, his face and shoulders like a god, for his divine mother had breathed on her son beautiful hair and the purple light of youth, and happy charms, that's the word I've translated honores, in his eyes. Just as hands add beauty to ivory, or when silver or Parian marble is encircled with yellow gold. So strange, until we remember that Pliny talks about purple as having that sheen, a kind of like some types of silk have a kind of a sheen to them. But that just shows how our concepts and theirs were so completely different, or just not completely, but just subtly different.
Yeah, and if we actually think back to both the Iliad and the Odyssey, there's a section in either, one to do with Helen, and I believe the other one is to do with Nausicaa and her mum Arete, and both of them are weaving, and they are weaving in threads of purple into what they're doing. Obviously that does link again to their social status, them being members of royal families. But it also is capturing how that the colours are, like you say, sort of a sheen, something that was really a way of infusing a different type of colour into a textile, which is then in itself telling a story. And so in that passage we've just discussed then, we've got the conjunction of Caesarium, so even though that means hair, and purple for royalty and rule, then that really is evoking, isn't it, Augustus, and visualizing this kind of godlike hero.
Yeah, yeah. And the kind of godlike beauty. And Augustus was portrayed as being very good looking, whether he was or not. There's that wonderful bronze head of him in the British Museum in room 70, I believe. He's very, very good looking. He looks like a young god. And that reminds us that purple can also be erotic. And remember Dido outstanding in purple and gold in that favorite passage of ours? And or is it the stallion of her desire that's outstanding in purple and gold? And Camilla, at the end of the last episode, I talked about the parade of Latins coming out of Latium after Ascanius accidentally kills the stag. And Virgil saves the last and the best for last, and last comes Camilla. And she's this beautiful virgin warrior girl modeled partly on Penthesilea the Amazon, partly on Diana the Huntress. And she's shown in purple with one breast exposed in proper titillating Amazonian fashion. And so here's the scene from the end of, right at the end of book 7, where the Virgil saves the best for last. Hos super advenit volsca de gente Camilla, illam omnis tectis agrisque effusa juventus, turbaque miratur matrum et prospectat euntum, attonitus in hians animis, ut regius ostro veletonos levesimeros ut fibula crinem auro internectat liciamut gerat ipsa faretram et pastoralem praefixa cuspide myrtum. Above all others came Camilla of the Volscan tribe. The young people, the young men maybe, pour out of houses and fields, and a crowd of mothers and admire her and watch her coming. They stand astonished and open-mouthed at how royal beauty covers her slim shoulders with purple, how a clasp contains her hair with gold, how she herself wears a Lydian quiver and holds a staff of myrtle fitted with a spear point.
There again, that royal combination of purple and gold. And we had it slightly earlier in this book as well, for Latinus to describe his horses, again in purple and gold, and showing that this regal opulence is still there in the proto-Rome, in Italy, as well as Carthage and Rome itself. It's really highlighting, I suppose, that royal connection all the way through, isn't it, for Augustus?
Exactly. That's one of the hyperlinks. And another hyperlink is that the gold and the purple on a woman, Dido's described in gold and purple, and so is Venus described in gold and purple. So now we get Camilla described in gold and purple. So she's erotic and royal and mysterious and decadent and intriguing. And I don't know if you remember, about 10 years ago, I was invited to do a retelling of her story for reluctant teens for Barrington Stoke, a publisher who specialized in books for dyslexic readers. And so I had fun taking all the scattered details about Camilla scattered throughout books 7 and 11. And I put them together to make a story told by her, but I thought I wouldn't tell it by her, so I tell it by her sidekick, her best friend. And I really loved the cover art of the original book produced by Barrington Stoke. And I've recently refreshed the book with a new cover by Flora Kirk. And it's now available in ebook and audio formats. And here's a little sample of my retelling of this story where I mention her purple cloak. And again, she's not telling the story because she dies in the end.
Spoilers.
Yeah, I won't. Well, I'll read that. It was noon by the time, this is Akka, her best friend, telling the story. It was noon by the time we were dressed and dry. The troops outside had been ready for hours. We could hear them chanting for Camilla. When we rode out of the city gates, their cheers reached the heavens. Camilla looked magnificent. Juturna had given her a short white tunic and a little purple cape. She had her silver arrows and a painted quiver. And I don't know if I could talk for hours about Camilla. We don't really know where Virgil got the idea. We know he got so many ideas from Homer, from Apollonius, from Ennius, from Catullus, from so many of the other poets. But we have no idea where Camilla came from. And maybe it was his own invention to kind of parallel the Penthesilea, who's not actually in the Iliad. She's in the cycle of the Troy cycle. But we've saved the strangest uses of purple for last. Do we have time to talk about Lavinia's blush?
I think we do, and I would love to talk about this. Yes.
So there's a very strange moment in the Aeneid when Lavinia who's the daughter of King Latinus, and it's like if you marry her, you consolidate your dynasties. Turnus, who's the at this point in the story, Aeneas's main opponent, governed by Juno a bit, he wants to marry her, and so does Aeneas. Aeneas maybe hasn't even seen her, but he wants to marry her to consolidate his new Troy. And there's a really strange moment where Lavinia blushes. This is right at the end. This is at the end of the Aeneid, at the beginning of book 12, the final book. And it's a little bit of a rabbit hole because it doesn't involve the word purpureus, but rubor, which means blush as well as red. And we already mentioned that flawis can be applied to hair and purpureus to cloth. So in the same way, rubor has to do with the skin of the face. And it's not like one of what we think. We think of pure colors, almost like Plato's abstract forms. It's always attached to a thing. So we start in the scene. Queen Amata is speaking, and she's the young wife of King Latinus and the mother of Lavinia. And King Latinus wanted to make peace with Aeneas, but then Juno sends a fury to poison Amata's heart. And she also has this kind of secret desire, we feel, for Turnus himself, which is slightly suspicious. There's an idea that she might be in love with Turnus herself. And she says in this scene that she does not want to live if Turnus dies. She's urging him to maybe not go into the battle. And when she says, "I don't want you to die, Turnus, if you die, I'll die too," her daughter Lavinia, who's watching, she weeps and then she blushes. And Lavinia, in the whole Aeneid, does not say one single word, but one scholar wrote that her blush speaks volumes. And what a blush! The color moves across her face in a quite alarming way, and this strangely excites Turnus. Do you want to read it, Katrina?
I will, and just before to say that it is frustrating, isn't it? Because we have such incredible characterization of Dido. We have Camilla, as we've just said, who's this almost sort of unique Virgilian invention, and he is really interesting how he builds that character. And then Lavinia is the person who could be so kind of integral to understanding Aeneas as well as understanding future Rome. She obviously it does have this pivotal role, but then we don't get any words from her. But this is the section, so Aeneid 12, line 61 onwards. Qui tecumque manent isto certamina causus, et mei terne manent. Simul haec invisia relinquam, lumina et generem aniam captiva videbo. Accepit, vocem lacrimis Lavinia matris flagrantis perfusa genas, qui plurimus ignem subiectit rubo et calefacta per ora curcurit. Indum sanguino veluti violauret ostro, siquis iber, aut mixta rubent ubi lilia multa alba rosa, talis vergo tabat ore colores. Illum turbat amor figit quae vergine voltus, ardet in arma magis.
Very nice. Now I'm going to translate that in a rather clunky way to show some of the subtext in some of the strange choice that translators hide from us what the words suggest here. So it starts, remember, Queen Amata is speaking, a young, let's say Lavinia's 14, 15, and Queen Amata's maybe 33, 34, 35. Whatever misfortunes await you in this struggle, Turnus, also await me at the same time as you. I will leave this unwelcome light of life. I will not as a captive see Aeneas as my son-in-law. Lavinia heard her mother's declaration. Her burning cheeks were bathed with tears. A deep reddish blush lit the fire beneath them, her cheeks, and ran across her warm face, as if someone had violated Indian ivory with blood-red purple, or when white lilies blush red when mixed with many roses. The Virgin revealed such colors in her face. Love excites Turnus, and he fixes his gaze on the unmarried girl. He burns even more for battle. So the Romans were quite obsessed with blushing, by the way, because it's an involuntary sign of deeper emotion, usually shame or arousal. Not necessarily bad things. Shame in a young man could be considered an attribute, an advantage. And in a girl, shame, of course, you're supposed to be ashamed, aren't you? Because it's, oh my gosh. And Seneca wrote a whole letter about the blush, essentially saying it reveals a person's true feelings. And commentators, again, suggest an ambiguity here. Is Lavinia blushing at the idea of Aeneas as her husband? And if so, is it a blush of excitement or humiliation, or is she blushing with excitement and arousal because the implication is that Turnus, the most desirable of all the Latin heroes, will be her husband with all that that entails? Now, only Virgil knows what was in Lavinia's mind, and he ain't talking.
No, he ain't. And it's another example like of this focalization where Virgil is painting a scene in this way really vividly with colours, with a simile, describing someone's appearance. We've looked at it before when it's describing a piece of artwork or a shield or something being created. But in a way, this is like literally drawing a portrait, isn't it? And then with this implication, seeing of who's noticing in the room. Is it just Virgil as the omniscient narrator noticing the blush? But would everybody else be aware of it? Is it capturing, a sense of she has revealed her true colours, literally, and her true feelings? But there's also kind of other parts at play here, particularly with this simile. And we also should draw attention to all those different words in that section for fire. And, it's really kind of very strong. We've got flagrantis, ignem subiecte, calefacta aura. It's a lot of fire to attribute to a blush. And I know that scholars have said that this is really showing that this is linked with love and, that erotic cause that we've said. And we have to go back to Homer. We have to go to Iliad Book 4, in fact, line 141, which is when Menelaus is wounded in battle. And again, weirdly, in that setting, the blood on his white skin is described as elephantafoinikiminen, or stained ivory with purple.
And look at those words. Elephanta, ivory is linked to our word elephant. Isn't that beautiful?
So clever.
And Phoeniki, purple, is linked to Phoenician. It's just so good. And then the word miene means stained. And this is, of course, a simile that, because Homer was everybody's textbook, everyone would have known this immediately. And it's not only Homer who's already famous, it's one of the most famous similes. And the passage talks about just as when some women, a woman of Myonia or Caria, stains ivory with purple for a horse's cheek piece, so the blood ran down on your shapely thighs, Menelaus, and your beautiful legs and ankles.
So again, that's an example of apostrophe. We talked about that in Virgil last week. Here's one of the rare examples in Homer, when the poet directly addresses a character.
Yeah.
But there's also a clever intertext, hyperlink, extended simile and allusion thing going on here, because the word in Homer as well about staining, kind of violo, is this really strong sense of defiling. That's also what we see in this passage with Virgil. And in a way, what that's doing is not only linking Lavinia's blush to Menelaus's wound, but it's linking the two things as wounds. It's like that Salkia we've mentioned before that Dido has, this love wound, that in a way you could argue that Lavinia's blush coming forward is an external representation of some sort of physical love affliction inside that is going to then affect her story and those of the characters around her.
Yeah, and it's also anticipating the actual wound of the first night of marriage, because the passage in Homer, believe it or not, was probably quite sexy. Thighs were considered an erotic part of the body, especially among men, and the purple red blood running down a shapely white thigh evokes the deflowering of a girl on her wedding night. And in Greco-Roman art, as we know, women are often portrayed as white in contrast to the brown or even dark, very dark-skinned men, and that there's an eroticism just in the contrast of white and dark bodies you find in the brothels in Pompeii, but on vases even. So Menelaus should not have white thighs, and yet his wound is likened to ivory stained with purple. So it's hinting he does have white thighs. Am I reading too much in this? I don't think so. And her strange blush is so dramatic that you said, who's watching? Well, Turnus is watching, and he sees it, and it makes his blood boil for battle, strangely, which is, I guess, that's all he can do. It's their equivalent of a cold shower. Perhaps he'll go out and fight somebody. In the 90s, a scholar named Roam Line wrote a famous article called Lavinia's Blush. Yes, these Virgil scholars, they will write a whole article on 2 lines.
Yeah, we thought we did deep dives, but this really is one, isn't it?
And he essentially says that this her over-the-top blush reveals her love, perhaps even her lust for Turnus, and that's what inspires the young Rutilian to want to fight. And he points out, again, because it's an involuntary blush, that it reveals her inmost thoughts. You know, you can be a clever orator and say what you want and twist the crowd, but if your face goes pink, you've blown it all. And Line says that if Lavinia is antiquity's most famous blusher, then Domitian, the evil emperor Domitian, must be its most infamous. The late first century Domitian, who succeeds Titus for about 14 years, he was so famously red-faced that nobody could ever tell if he felt remorse or shame. Tacitus, in his book Agricola 45:2, mentions this and talks about this and says that his inability to reveal shame or humility actually started to affect his emotions, and so that he became unable to feel shame or remorse. And it's fascinating because just as we see purple often teamed with gold, we see rubor, blush, reddish blush, combined with pallor, a paleness. So that's a combination. And again, very, very erotic often. And when we get white and purple, that's often erotic. White, purple and gold, royal, purple and white, erotic. So we've seen so many words and concepts in Virgil of purple. We've seen Rome, its magistrates and emperors. We've seen in Phoenica and Carthage, the decadence, the extravagance. We've seen its royalty and power associations, its beauty and nature, its associations with blood and death, its hyperlinks to youthful energy and eroticism and sexual desire, all in one word.
Yeah. So we hope that you have taken so much from that episode, all of those different themes and associations that we've covered. Do take your time to listen back through, to read through some of the passages as well. We'd really encourage a closer reading of some of these sections because they really are beautiful, and the hyperlinks are there to be found and to be enjoyed. And lots of lovely links to Homer as well. I think it's ever reason to go back and revisit Homer too. Thank you for joining us for our purple episode. If you found any other examples of purple in Virgil or indeed in any other Latin and Roman authors, they are out there for sure, not just in Martial. We'd love to hear them, to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining us. Please make sure that you are liking and subscribing because we can't do this without you. We're on episode 11. This is our 11th week of producing this podcast, and I know we've had so much fun doing it, but we really appreciate you watching and sharing. Please send an episode to a friend, get them to fall in love with Virgil and join us on our quest to enjoy the Aeneid and share it with everybody.
Ave atque vale.
Mind how you go.